thanks today for Cadell Last of Philosophy Portal joining us in Sense Space here with Matthew Green as we delve into the spirit of the resonant man. Cadell and I have had some really cracking dialogues recently, exploring quite extensively masculinity and the philosophy of man that Cadell has developed over a number of years, involved in men's work and more deeply thinking about what it means to become a man in the world today, what it means to die into masculinity as a process of continual death, transformation, and rebirth. So I feel like we're on a really interesting philosophical footing with this conversation. And Matthew and I are also going to be introducing and sharing about the Resonant Man project, the initiative that we're going to be launching initially this June. And I'm really excited to kind of situate that in the context of that broader conversation of what it means to kind of put forward a positive response to the condition of men in the world today and start to kind of generate vision for what that can be like. So really glad to be here with you both.
Yeah, super honored to be here. It's been a delight collaborating with Space, and I love to see the little seeds you're planting here, Jacob, and just excited to help in any way to make those grow. So I think it's super important for the space as a whole, and I think the more psychedelic Jacob videos I see on my Instagram feed, I get like a fractal Jake, like whoa, coming at me. I think the better my scrolling is.
Yeah, no, I put out a wonderful promo for Conscious Cannabis Culture event this weekend, so you need to. I'll send that along, Matthew. But yeah, Matthew, perhaps you and I can just open up here. What is the resonant man, and why is he coming forth in this moment, in this time? Why have we found ourselves brought together, as two men, very different life paths, very different generations, but somehow harmonized. And ultimately, after several years, called to actually kind of channel and create the vision for this first big collaboration between the two of us.
Yeah, it does feel like it's unfolded in a way. I don't want to say effortlessly because we have put in a lot of work in terms of elaborating the vision of what we want to offer and diving into the kinds of conversations that you've obviously been having also with Cadell, which have laid the ground for this kind of work to grow. But at the same time, there is a kind of fluidity and flow to what we're doing, which is enjoyable. It doesn't feel like work, actually. And I think that's a good sign.
Mm.
I've come from the background of working with Thomas Hubel, the facilitator, doing large group processes to integrate collective and intergenerational and individual trauma, and really becoming much more, I guess, literate in how we can create healing spaces, actually. And although we're not really calling this like a healing space, I think that's what it will do. I think that it will have, it will create a field where we can relate in ways, establish or that establish a certain level of safety that will allow us to connect and begin to surface some of what we're holding and what we're carrying, and gradually let that go and step more fully into the kind of, I guess, masculinity, Jacob, that you alluded to, that speaks to the moment, even if we're not starting out with a fixed agenda of what that should be, what that should look like. More honoring the idea that that is something that will emerge and flow forth. So I could say more, but maybe that's a good place to rest for now.
Oh, that's great. And also, since this is the first time introducing you and Cadell, I'm happy to bring a bit more of your biography and kind of get to know each of your stories of where you come into this and why this is such a point of importance for us all here. But yeah, I thoroughly concur. I mean, this is really this Resonant Man is a confluence of a number of different threads that we've been exploring, as you say, the Thomas Hübl work that you've been immersed in for several years. In addition to that, you've been involved in men's work for several years. You facilitated a number of groups. I also facilitated and then ended up kind of creating vision for a few groups over the last few years. And for me, the intersection of Dialogos and men's work was also a really promising avenue. Traditionally, a men's circle provides context for accountability, showing up with consistency. Potentially, there's some exploration of your goals, your vision, but also potentially more importantly, a place where you show up authentically and share what's going on in the reality of your life, and have men who are actually in a space of listening and attuning to that. And this actually dovetails very beautifully with what's cultivated in Dialogos, which is kind of a higher level attunement and listening, not just to the individuals, but to the field as a whole. And so ultimately, then there's a kind of tapping into an emergent magic and an emergent potential that's available between men. And in this respect, it does feel like we show up for the work to happen. We show up to serve the work, but the work has a kind of agency of its own and an intelligence of its own. And ultimately, I think that's given both of us the sense that, like in this time in particular, the resonant man is needed. It wants to come into expression and articulation in response to the world as we face it. So, Cadell, I wonder if just beginning to bring you in a bit more here, I'd love for you to share a bit more about your road into this as well, for Matthew's benefit and also for the audience, because they may not be aware that you've been involved quite significantly, and there's quite a background to how you've been thinking through men and men's spaces and the role of masculinity in a landscape of cultural confusion.
Yeah, that's a really good way of framing it, a landscape of cultural confusion. I mean, I can't introduce the way I came into this. And I first want to sort of state as an opening, and I'll kind of circle back around to it, that I appreciate the way you guys are framing the idea of the resonant man, and hopefully I'll be able to make some connecting points to that as we come to the end of just a brief introduction. I don't think I can frame my introduction to men's work outside of my experience of academia. And specifically sort of tuning in to the fact that there was kind of like this not so subtle negativity around masculinity as such, as well as a whole bunch of symptoms being expressed within academia as such, that I felt could not be addressed without pointing out the elephant in the room, that there's this sort of, deep-seated bias against masculinity, almost, well, like you could say it's inherently toxic. And so, I've never wanted to be going into, and here I want to sort of presence that I've never wanted to enter a political space and a political mentality that was too reactive. Meaning I never wanted to then, okay, I see that there's this negative bias against masculinity. There's this almost doctrine of toxic masculinity. I didn't want to then, even though I resonated with a lot of the reactive politics, I didn't want to then become embroiled myself in those sort of reactive dynamics. My first intuition was actually quite similar to what it seems like your intuition is, Jacob, which was to find a space of dialogos. So finding that space of dialogos was the origin of the Sex Masculinity God book, which was basically my attempt to carve out a little space of dialogos of my own before that sort of had become sort of a, let's say, a psychotechnology that people were actively practicing with. just to explore without censorship about how I would make sense of my own masculinity today. Really, a lot of the themes, the things that we've been talking about. What does it mean to become a man today? What, ultimately, masculinity itself is not a term you can just rest at. So you have to die into your masculinity. That's why it was sex, masculinity, and God, not just sex and masculinity. Um, masculinity also vanishes beyond itself in some way. But really searching out a space of Dialogos that was just free of any sort of institutional censorship or like being concerned, like really concerned about building a space of Dialogos where I wasn't, as it were, walking on eggshells. Or afraid that if I said the wrong thing, I might be kicked out of the room. And that actually happened to me one time when I was at University of Toronto. I was teaching some undergrads a class about how to become a popular science writer. And I said to the class collectively, "You guys," and that was deemed as sexist. And the whole talk was shut down because I said "you guys" as a generic term. But that's just like the level of the cultural sensitivity here that like was brewing. Long story short, I found myself leading my own men's circle during coronavirus. That was very successful. I also got involved with a men's circle in London when I was in London during coronavirus with a close collaborator named Owen Cox. And one thing led to another, and I find myself presenting at the European men's movement around the themes of sex, masculinity, and God. So it was really not something of it was not something of like a direct affirmation that I really need to get involved in men's work. It was more just coming from a need to work through what masculinity meant for me so I could sense make it myself. And first and foremost, that's not disconnected from relating to the feminine, because really what I was struggling with was, how do I build a long-term sexual relationship? How do I start to build out a sense of a life world? And how do I, and inclusive of the fact that this is the body I appear in, and all of the different affects and all of the different emotions and drives that come with the body that I inhabit. So that's really the long story short of it. And I will say as a closing remark that where I find a resonance with what you guys are talking about with the Resonant Man, and specifically Matthew, your sort of connection to Thomas Hübel's work, collective trauma, the collective trauma perspective, is that I really, on my side, see that there's a split within masculine work between people who tend towards religion and people who tend towards what I would call more either psychoanalytic or psychotherapeutic approach. And I think that I usually find myself on the psychoanalytic, psychotherapeutic side of things, precisely because of the relationship to speaking about trauma and speaking about symptoms, and reflecting on symptoms and trauma, not being afraid of negative affects and difficult sexual emotions, and wanting to sort of have a space with other men who are capable of bringing that to reflection, because I feel like I just feel like intellectually I can go deeper in that way. That's not to negate the religious side of things, because I also have experience on a religious side as well. I just see that bifurcation within the masculine work culture. And I think it's important to presence that, not to take one side or the other, but just to even hold that as like a meta dialogos. Like, can we have a conversation about what's going on there and what might be at work there? Because there's a lot of power at that schism as well, because you do see people who either, and I saw this within the European, before just now closing, I did see at the European Men's Network, which is why I took more of a distance, is that I did see at the European Men's Network this perspective which therapy and analysis was feminine, and talking about emotions and thinking about trauma and symptomologies was just a woman's work. and not something that men should be doing, but men should just be, sucking it up and you've got your Bible and just get to work type of mentality. So that I just see this as a interesting intersection to play with, but yeah, I'll close with that.
I could maybe jump in there. That's fascinating, Cadell, to hear that. I wasn't aware of the landscape that you're describing, and I certainly wasn't aware that there's a kind of bifurcation in that movement in the way you describe, and I find that fascinating. Yeah, certainly, I don't feel like me and Jacob will be saying that we just need to get our Bible and and work. Like I don't have a Bible handy, but I wonder whether there's something echoing back to what you referenced about Thomas Hübel's work, because I mean that's the tradition or the work I've been very immersed in for the last 2 or 3 years, and it feels to me like quite a rich integration of both, in that we certainly do explore our individual trauma and how collective or intergenerational trauma may be manifesting in us, and we look at that in a relational field in groups, and the whole essence of the work is understanding how we can evoke a kind of collective intelligence that begins to emerge when we come together with certain intention and certain relational practices and establish that really safe container. At the same time, it is very much rooted in the mystical tradition. There's a lot of meditation. We talk about connecting with the light, which is very much a kind of I guess perennial religious or spiritual idea that we're kind of connecting to something bigger. And there's no dogma, there's no religion attached, but we'll certainly talk about mystical principles of trauma healing, working with subtle competencies, subtle energy. And there is a very explicitly spiritual component to it. I mean, that's really the framework within which the work takes place. So I feel maybe I sound somewhat evangelical, if that's the right word, about that work, but it feels to me like quite a powerful integration of those two impulses. Yeah, I don't know what Jacob, how that lands for you.
Yeah, I think there's actually there's a very strong dovetail for me in the practices of Dialogos and emergent dialogue, and for me they're kind of the level of what we call collective intelligence and collective wisdom, and the level of connecting with spirit or connecting with God can be kind of just like almost stacked on top of one another, or overlapping in some way, and it depends on what context I'm in, which language I will evoke. But definitely for me, the spiritual connection is essential to the resonant man. We're not shying away from that. We're also certainly not delivering any kind of orthodox standpoint. I mean, as you know, Cadell, I've been wrestling with Christianity and equally on a journey in the plant medicine world, and Matthew's journeyed through, a whole kind of spread of different paths himself as well. And so there's a lot to be said about soul in this, and the notion of the soul's curriculum, and where is the soul's curriculum leading me, and the kind of attunement that we're bringing and cultivating in the group space is ultimately the same attunement we want to bring to our own process, our own world, our own landscape. And I've always felt that that kind of high fidelity intuition, the more that I speak with Christians, the more I see, okay, this is very similar to what they're calling listening for where God wants me to go, or listening for where spirit is leading me. So there's a real similarity there. And that's, I would say, if there's a kind of pinnacle of where we want to reach with the resonant man, apart from a sense of being more fully in ourselves, and kind of at home in that. It's to feel in tune with the resonance of our own souls and our own soul's kind of direction, and to feel like, okay, the world can go where it's going to go and things going to move around and there's going to be trouble, but I can tune into that resonant frequency myself, and that's going to help me to know where I need to go, where is my greatest impact. And that might not be uh, something so obviously what the world has told you is most important. It might be that your greatest impact is somehow hidden or off to the side. And that also speaks to the model of transformation that we've been exploring and cultivating, which is really that you don't know. It's not about necessarily being up on stage with the microphone. It's happening within you. It's like you're the connecting point in this web of relationality, and all of the transformation, all of the attunement, the trauma release, the integration, all of it ripples outwards into the entire relational field, and ultimately kind of liberates more awareness and presence that we can then apply to our lives and problems and the nature of leadership, and all of these things. So that's some of the deeper landscape of Resonant Man.
I love it. I mean, for me, it's really helping me work through what I see as the meta tension that I observe between Freud and Jung since I've gotten into psychoanalysis. Because since I've gotten into psychoanalysis, of course, you immediately confront this tension between Freud and Jung, and Freud is usually seen as more the clinical thinker who's working with individual symptoms, sexual history, trauma. And then Jung is usually seen more as a mystical visionary, someone who's working with collective archetypes and the collective unconscious. And this tension between Freud and Jung obviously might itself be seen manifest in the integration that you're talking about with Thomas Hubel's work, where there is the sort of the recognition of let's say, trauma of sexual history, intergenerational dynamics, Oedipal structures with mother, father, child, all of these types of things going on. But at the same time, a recognition of, let's say, a collective spiritual dimension, which requires sort of, attunement using language of soul work and things like this. Which I do myself sort of have the deepest sympathy with going in that direction, with going in a direction that brings somehow the two of them together, because I think just ending with clinical work is a dead end, but also religious work that doesn't include the clinical as a dead end. So I like the idea of a marriage between these two dimensions of what we've learned, basically about reflecting on our own psyches, and reflecting on the nature of psyche as such. And I think that brings me to the dimension of your project that makes me most excited, which is what you were talking about. Well, two dimensions you were talking about, Jacob, which is one, the world can go however it wants to go. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, it's not about me on stage with a microphone. So I think those two dimensions, bringing those two dimensions together, are the most powerful, because when the world can go however it wants to go, that to me is a shift from external cognition to internal cognition. And when you shift from external cognition to internal cognition, you're really focusing not about controlling the world, and getting some sort of predictive mechanism where you can make the world conform in a symmetry with the way you think, but rather sort of recognizing that you already have a type of internal symmetry with your own will. And that internal symmetry with your own will is, it's not going to produce a symmetry in the world. It's going to produce unexpected consequences. But because you always have that capacity to go back to yourself in a spiritual sense, whether it's attunement to the soul, if you whatever language we want to use, attunement to the soul, where God wants me to go. All of us are going to have our own languages and language games for these things, which for me, I don't want to get too caught up in myself. But ultimately, to me, it's about discovering, I guess, the language I feel most comfortable with. It's about discovering some sort of dimension of freedom within oneself. That's the language that and what I mean by freedom within oneself is that you're not dependent on the deterministic mechanisms of the external world for your self-security. And I think that that's really the dimension that's a lot of, let's say, deterministic scientists leave out when they're analyzing the relationship, say, between determinism and freedom, is just this shift from external cognition to internal cognition. And then from that point of view, I think you don't have to be so concerned with whether or not you're the one on stage with the microphone, and you can much more enter into a space of, like you said, Jacob, this dimension of relationality, where it's really about the interaction between different wills and interacting with different sort of free spirits, and seeing how the effects ripple out from there is just it's a total worldview transformation. And so operating from that standpoint, whether you come at it from the sort of the therapeutic angle or whether you come at it from the religious angle, I think it ultimately brings us to the same space, which is maybe that's the resonant man.
Yeah, well put, Cadell. I'll just add a few pieces there before I bring it to Matthew. I think that really connects with where we got to yesterday with OG Rose, and that was a real deep exploration of the distinction between planning and preparation, and the sensibility that a lot of the induction into masculinity that our culture gives us or that our workplaces give us is it has this very external quality. It's like, well, if you have the right job and you're putting these things in line and you're kind of, paying the mortgage and planning for the future, you've got it already. But there's a different quality of preparedness for uncertainty that we've been looking at and cultivating. And I actually believe that, challenge is so important to masculinity. And part of the challenge that I've been exploring extensively in my own journey is how to come into a greater intimacy and faithfulness with uncertainty in my own path. And so we draw that into the actual process of the dialogue, and we view the dialogue and the emergent process itself as a kind of training ground for the encounter with the unexpected. Whether that's an unexpected conversation or choosing a completely novel and unexpected direction in one's own life path. But that's a really new skill, and I think that's kind of an essential kind of meta-modern navigation technique. And maybe it goes without saying, but we'll stress it here. Like, Matthew's been involved in the climate space for several years, and we're tuned in to the meta crisis dimensions of this, and we've had a number of dialogues with kind of actors in the climate space, exploring how these same principles are deeply relevant there, and actually responding to what seems like a fairly unresolvable, stuck issue actually involves shifting consciousness, shift in relationality, and the same principle of what's going on out there is actually intimately related with what's going on in here and within us. So, Matthew, I know you launched a new project very recently, Toxic Workplace Survival Guy, or Survival Guide, it's become in my head. But yeah, I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to that distinction of, like, kind of being on the rails of a masculinity that's given to you versus that sort of sense of a true navigation of, oh, I'm actually following my soul's purpose now.
Wow, that's such a big question. And I don't by any means feel like I've necessarily arrived at my destination, and I can now explain to everyone else how to do that. It's it's like I'm still absolutely a work in progress in that regard, but I can at the same time acknowledge and notice that I have gone through some quite stark transitions in recent years. I mean, I became a father 6 years ago, and that really was a moment of crisis for me. Actually, I really struggled, especially in the first few months, because I wasn't really prepared psychologically or even really financially. Although I'd had quite a successful career as a journalist prior to that, I was freelancing and I'd written a book and I was giving talks, but I wasn't really succeeding on the convention. I think the kind of conventional measures of masculinity that maybe Jacob you're alluding to. Like I didn't have at that point like a secure, well-paid job, high status role. And when my daughter came along, it really was a crisis for me because I realized that I hadn't put that structure in place. And there was a part of me that really wanted to have that structure around me in that situation. And the hardest part was that I hadn't seen it coming. I'd been in a state of denial, I would say, or avoidance around the actual reality of having a child and all that came with that. And also, I would also add, I think I didn't have men around me who could almost say, hey, like, are you, do you know what's coming? Like, are you ready for this? I was quite alone with it when I look back. And I think that was quite painful part of the whole experience as well. And I hadn't particularly intended to talk about this, but from your question, Jacob, that's really the start of it. Was that real crisis? It was very serious, actually. I got very, very depressed. And I was lucky in a sense because I was taken back into a big organization that I'd worked in for many years before and had a year or so, or even a year and a half, where it went really well. And I was enjoying it and I had great colleagues. And I felt actually I'm living my purpose. This is my soul has somehow, I felt, although I had my reservations about certain parts of being back in corporation, I felt like, wow, the path is opening for me. Like I meant to be doing this. And then that all changed. And probably for legal reasons, I shouldn't go into the details, but I recognized that I was in a toxic environment, that I was not who I was or what I wanted to bring was not welcome. And not only not welcome, was actually almost I felt the hostility, which I'd never encountered before in the workplace. And it was a pretty traumatic time in a different way. And it led me to leave. And now I work for a non-profit climate news service focused on climate accountability, which feels very aligned. And I can stand beside that work and feel like I'm serving a movement that I believe in, which isn't necessarily the end of the soul's call, but it's certainly congruent with it. And the newsletter I launched almost at a spontaneous moment of actually counseling another man, a very good friend of ours, who was going through his own ordeal, which had certain parallels to mine. And out of those conversations, he was like, "You're good at this. Like, you should write about this." And I saw, and I came up with this idea, this title, "Toxic Workplace Survival Guide." It's like slightly tongue in cheek in a way, but I see that I'm actually trying to use the newsletter to distill a lot of the essence of the wisdom path that I've been walking, the Thomas Hübl teachings, and the other kinds of modalities that I've been working with, but almost smuggling them in the context of ostensibly a workplace support offering. But really it's a way of almost offering nuggets of what I've learned, or sharing practices or insights that have been really helpful for me in a more targeted way than I'd be able to if I was just kind of sharing, wisdom with the world. I don't think I'm quite ready to take on that mantle, but I can talk to you about what it's like to be in a toxic workplace because I understand it very well. And I can offer you the best of what I've picked up over the last decade of walking this path, see if it might be of some help. So we'll see where that project goes, but it's fun to have that kind of I kind of invited myself, self-anointed, that I would offer this guidance, and people like it. So yeah, we'll see where it goes.
One thing I've kind of, I think we both observed during the course of drawing this out is like the resonant man, I think for you has been, it's still kind of like a countercultural or contracultural edge. And if you look back at where you were 5 years ago, would you have been involved in something like this, or would you have been comfortable to be using this kind of mythic and soulful language? And like how does this kind of soulful offering meet with the kind of mainstream corporate world?
Yeah,
and the culture as it stands today? And I want to bring you in on that as well, Cadell, because like I want to get a greater sense of the cultural context in which we're sending out this call and trying to propagate this signal.
Shall I respond
Yeah.
briefly, and obviously want to hand over to Cadell, but I love the question, because I guess 5 years pre-pandemic, we were doing men's work with Rebel Wisdom, where that was the first time I remember David Fuller getting in touch, and our mutual friend calling me to a group of men's leaders, or like men's work facilitators. And I never even knew this existed this is what, 2017, 18, or a few years before the pandemic, certainly. I had no idea that this was even a thing. And I did a retreat with Rebel Wisdom, which I think you were also on, Jacob. And I thought, wow, there's something in this. There's something about a men's space, a wisdom-oriented men's space with the right facilitation that is very powerful. And that was a discovery for me. But at that point, I would nowhere near have had the confidence to really have stood up and talked about this in the way we're doing now. And in the book, I at that time, I'd recently published a book on military veterans seeking new ways to heal from trauma. And I was tiptoeing into I was moving from the psychological to sort of towards the spiritual level in some of what I'd written and what I would say, but I was dipping my toe in the water. What's changed for me is being back in the corporate environment and realizing that it's very difficult for me to kind of fit myself into this power over structure. And also, as I say, the work with Thomas Hübl has really been transformative and has given me a reliable or a reliability about that connection. Like the language of the soul for me has taken on a much more tangible reality. It's gone from theory into practice in a way that it had started to do in previous years. And I'd had glimmers and glimpses, fleeting moments. Whereas now I feel like I can navigate that connection, or establish that connection, or invite that connection much more. And I don't like to say reliably, because it's always grace in a way. And yet it feels more alive, more palpable, more real, more trustable than it did before. So I guess that's my evolution. But yeah, and how this will go into the corporate world, I don't know. Tomorrow, I'm actually going to do some openings, remarks, and a panel at a conference on trauma in journalism with big news organizations, lots of executives from a very corporate environment. But because I have the kind of background from that world and this new world, it'll be a stage where I'm going to try to bring the two together and see if I can tread that line. And I may not use the language I'm using here, but I still believe that ultimately we have souls and we recognize soul to soul. And there's a way of conveying a certain resonance, a certain energy that will land, and the language doesn't have to get in the way of that. So thank you for that question. Cadell, I'd love to hear from you how that lands for you, and whether you recognize any of what I'm describing.
There's a lot there, man. I think that like the two themes that I want to run with most centrally. The one theme is what you brought up in regards to what you were unprepared for entering fatherhood, that is having a type of external structure in place to raise kids. Because I don't want to say that having I don't want to say that external cognition is only bad. There is an importance of external cognition, and having an external structure in place to raise kids is incredibly important. And I think if we lose that dimension of the equation, what we're losing is a privileging of sort of inner spirituality, which is not taking seriously the fact that we are politically, economically marginalized. And we're in a situation where political economy is a major issue, and political economy has to be approached through external structures. And I think that we do not have a political economy that helps men be fathers. We do not have a political economy that helps men raise families. We do not have a pro-family. We do not have a pro-patriarchal family culture. And that has a huge psychological toll. That has a huge psychological impact. And that's not to say that in any way I'm trying to negate or bash the progress with feminine movements in that direction. I'm just saying that the space for men to be fathers and to provide and to put external structures in place so they can raise families is an important dimension of the equation. And in that trend, in that direction, we do also need states and corporations and institutions. We can't just deconstruct. We can't just do away with states and corporations and institutions. The problem is, how do we bring that soul dimension? How do we ensoul these dimensions of the state, instead of creating again this binary between the spiritualist in the inner dimension and the externalist in the outer dimension, who's been desouled and sacrificed his or her soul for accommodating in whatever bureaucracy or corporate ladder or corporate structure was required to maximize profit, or to, I mean, in many ways, it's all coming down to maximizing profit at the end of the day with a lot of these structures. But I just have a story here of how important getting both of these dimensions right is, because, and I can link this to planning and preparation in regards to, say, becoming a father. So I had a friend when I was growing up who always seemed to have the right plan. And I had this friend who always seemed to be ahead of everyone else with his plan. And in part, he was ahead of everyone else with his plan because he had a father who was there. And that was my perception. His father was there. His father always helped him up. His father always gave him an extra boost. His father always gave him opportunities that many of my friends growing up in a lower class, whatever welfare neighborhood didn't have. And so there was a bit of an envy there and a bit of a jealousy there in relationship to him, seeing as we perceived him having a little bit of a leg up. In any case, I remember being at his house, and now he has a big house. He has a lot of money. He has a beautiful wife. He has two beautiful kids. He literally has like a theater in his basement. And we were sitting outside his house after a nice barbecue, and I was just, being there in the silence after the meal. And I could tell that the silence was bothering him a little bit. And he said in one moment, "Is this it? Like, is this it?" Like he was disappointed. And what he was expressing there is so important, because what he was disappointed with was that he had only focused on the plan, and he had only focused on the external cognition. And he wasn't really connected with the inner soul journey. He hadn't ensouled the process, right? So he said, "Is this it?" Because if you just have the external trappings, and this is like, basically, I'm telling the story of, like, we should not forget that this vision of the external cognition was the American dream. It's what many North Americans and what people in the Western world live by and have, in some sense, suffered the desoulment through. So I don't think we should forget that part of it. And I think when we have gone through these processes, like you're facilitating with the sense spaces, and like I've tried to do in my philosophical space, and like it sounds like you've been doing, Matthew, with the collective trauma and healing work and the rebel wisdom journey, and all of those dimensions, we should not forget that we are bringing something intrinsically valuable, which you can't leave. It's not measurable and it's not externally visible, but it's a key dimension of the process. That if this is left out, then our societies are going to fundamentally suffer. And it is related to the orientation of wisdom in, I would say, men's and women's spaces, but we do need men's and women's spaces. But what I saw in those rebel wisdom spaces, and I want to just explain my perspective, but please call me out if you think I'm off on this. What I saw in these spaces was that there was a little bit of a naivete and a little bit of a lack of recognition for um, some of the more disturbing elements of sexuality, and specifically how important it is for the man to have his sexuality recognized in sort of relationship with and in integration with woman and child. And I think that that's where we really find soul's purpose. To me, soul's purpose is always having to be linked with man, woman, and child in some way. It's some sort of triad, and that's, I think, why psychoanalysis starts with the Oedipal crisis as the central crisis. Like, the Oedipal crisis is when something is wrong between man, woman, and child. Like, if something's off with man, woman, and child, then basically the world falls apart. And so, like, for me, it all starts there, and like getting real there with like, there is like huge unanswerable questions about how do men and women form healthy long-term relationships when there's not a big, and these are the dimensions that I would like to throw out there and help think through, because maybe it will be relevant to both of you and our viewers. When both men and women don't have a big age gap, when both men and women are well educated, when both men and women have a career, and when both men and women want to use their education and their career to forward advance themselves, how do they then also hold long-term relationship with each other? That seems to be the key problem to me that needs to be solved, because I don't think and I think that's the only solution that's scalable. I don't think we can scale going back to a traditional life world. I don't think we can scale taking women out of education. I don't think we can scale women being outside of careers. I think we have to affirm women full education, affirm women full careers, affirm and all these and also affirm urban living. Like, we can't just all move to rural neighborhoods. So like, when we include all of those dimensions, how do we then build long-term relationships? Because that's the key thing that we're struggling with, is that in urban societies where both men and women are educated and have careers, relationships fall apart. And then there's all this friction and division between the sexes, and birth rates plummet. So that to me is like where we have to put like really our wisdom. That to me is where the wisdom conversation is. Like, the wisdom conversation is like right there. So like, how do we hold space for that? And so like, just to sort of close, um, and on this note here of sort of in some sense defending men's work as preparing us for this wisdom conversation, I've sort of had enough experience now in holding philosophical spaces where I think men, even if they're philosophically trained, if they haven't done the men's work, they struggle to hold even philosophy spaces, precisely because they struggle to hold that younger guy's energy, that younger man's energy, or fail to sort of situate their cognition in an intergenerational way. And they probably also struggle to situate their cognition in relationship to women. So all of these things, I think, is that men's work should be seen as in synergy with philosophy, and philosophy in synergy with men's work, and ultimately bringing us to, I think, what you guys would call the meta crisis. But what I'd frame as the meta crisis is, again, this hyper urbanized, highly educated culture where both sexes are in the workplace. And how do we have long-term relationships in that and raise children and families in this way without regressing to more traditional reactionary positions?
You want to take that one, Jacob, or should I?
I'm gonna start with something no professed expert should say, which is I don't know. I don't know. The question you're pointing at is so difficult to think through. Like I feel the question leaves me sort of barren of of response, and yet it does point more or less at some of the heart of the problem. Um, I do think there are other dimensions of metacrisis. Like there's something between the frame of metacrisis that Matthew and I have been working with and what you've described that also needs to be brought together to understand that problem space. Like there's something about the technocratic, systematized world which does away with distinction, especially a mixed workplace and so on. Like there is a doing away with distinction, which social justice has also kind of sought to um, bring forward as well. And as you say, back in the academy, there was this hostility to masculinity. And as we've seen in the last 20 years, where the academy begins, the rest of culture follows. So there's something about that kind of environment that's become hostile to distinction, both at the level of like speech and philosophy, but also energetically and sexually and spiritually. The notion that there are distinctions is in a state of rejection right now in culture. And so having a context where we can begin to explore how do we naturally feel distinct, maybe is part of the starting point. Having something that is in parallel to our external lives and supportive of that, like the men who are participating in these groups are ultimately going to have their own careers, they're going to have their own paths, but then they're going to come into a space where the rule book and the narrative of the workplace potentially is able to soften, and they're able to begin to ask some deeper questions. And in that context, I don't think it's just about the um like there's a kind of triad here, I suppose, between the healing and the therapeutic, between the spiritual, and then we do feel philosophy is right in there. And actually having a space where values are being explored, where virtues are being explored, and where we're cultivating the capacity to do that and to draw out the essences of these things. That I see as building foundational capacity that has been wholesale neglected, if not actively deconstructed and abandoned. Like there are forces in culture that don't want us to have the capacity to sense deeply, think deeply, cultivate our own thought, cultivate our own distinction, and engage in a process of wrestling where we're actually going to be mutually transformed and get somewhere we didn't get to. And until those capacities are more readily available, those impossible questions just cannot even be approached. Like we're in an early stage of the process, it feels like, of creating this space alongside the mainstream cultural conversation where we can go deeper into it, where we can cultivate it, and then it bleeds back out. It kind of goes across the membrane a little bit into those spaces in this spirit of we don't know, we don't have a prescription for what the resonant man is going to do. We don't know what conversation he's going to end up in, what relational dynamics he's going to be navigating. We're trying to work at like the foundational level of his capacity to forthrightly, earnestly attend to those with as much awareness as possible. And so in that sense, the cultivation of these foundational capacities will ripple out into a myriad different spaces, like water kind of moving through cracks in glass or something. And so that's my way of saying I still don't know how we address that problem at the level of political economy. But there's a sensibility that I think we can cultivate that will create the conditions where we can begin to have the conversation without shutting down, without being triggered, whilst being able to really be sharp and hold each other accountable to our own thought and our own expression. So that's how I would begin to respond to that. But Matthew, I feel like you're, being a father, you're actually much a father who lives in an open environment with a wife who is also, a professional. Like you're much
That's
closer
why
to
I wanted to
this.
bring that up also, as I thought maybe Matthew would resonate with this specific triangulation of
Yeah.
the problem.
Yeah, I think, I welcome the question, and I recognize the challenge. I mean, in my own case, I'm very fortunate in how my relationship has evolved. I'm married to my wife, Genevieve. She's a clinical psychologist, so she's on the path. I mean, she's been I would say, on the path and ahead of me for a long time. So I'm trying to catch up with her. So we're in a kind of evolution. We're very explicitly, or sort of acknowledge explicitly that we're constantly evolving and working on our relationship as well. And I think on a very practical level, what we're doing in men's work with really noticing our processes, really paying attention to the triggers, even learning and practicing sort of relational skills, deeper listening, tracking our own responses at the emotional level, the mental level, the physical level as we're interacting. These skills are like super helpful for relating to everyone, like including and especially arguably women. So what I mean, even we're not necessarily, I mean, I agree that there's a kind of construct we're in that makes it really difficult and stressful for a lot of people to maintain their relationships. And there's a lot of unhappiness and a lot of pain out there on both sides, as it were. And the work we're doing is just basically really helpful for any whatever stage you're in that, whether you're single, whether you're in a relationship, whether the relationship is thriving or facing challenges. The work we do is super helpful in a very practical, like tangible way, because it's more than just about it is. I love your phrase, Jacob, the Tai Chi of dialogue. And I love how you model that. And I hear that emerging in these dialogos. But it's more than the dialogue that we're working with, isn't it? It's the feelings, it's being with our reactions, it's cultivating more capacity to hold our triggers in awareness, to work with them, to own them, to repair when we transgress or lose it or say the wrong thing, like to find that humility. And all of these qualities we're cultivating in the Resonant Man and other men's groups. And so at some basic level, it's just super helpful to have these skill sets online. So yeah, but I haven't solved the riddle at the higher level, but I just think day to day it's helpful. And ultimately, it's whenever I post something about men's work on social media, the first supportive comments and likes are always from women. And there's a reason for that, right?
Yeah, I think framing men's work as fundamentally synergistic with the civilizational project, inclusive of men and women and children, is a key framing, and I think one that both, like the more maybe explicitly religious side of men's work, and one the more spiritual or therapeutic side of men's work can both speak to and both play a role in. What I want to sort of just highlight in regards to what I was trying to center as like the key sort of impossibility of the wisdom space, where we have to sort of almost prepare ourselves for confronting this impossibility, is that, and correct me if you think I'm off on this, Jacob, but what I see in the meta crisis wisdom space is that it has transitioned from the 2020s, from 2020 to now, into more of a Christian wrestling. So I don't think the Christian, and this is to point to what you're focusing on, Jake, as with wrestling with Christianity, that I don't think the wrestling with Christianity and that sort of explicit wrestling with a specific denominational religion and the figure of Christ was as explicit in 2020 as it is now. This is something that's emerged. And what's interesting is that it's emerged internal to the meta crisis wisdom space. And I think that should be recognized, that there's been some fundamental transformation in the focus of these wisdom spaces. And I think you've got your finger on the pulse with wrestling with Christianity. But why is that? Why has this happened? Why has that become the center point? And I think that the reason why it's become the center point is because the meta crisis wisdom spaces were focusing on the ecology and the whole planet, and like trade, like it was focused on like how crazy the entire world is, but it wasn't focused on man, woman, and child. And I think that's what the Christian wrestling is about. It's about the Trinity. It's about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's about and it's about the consequences of that for building a family. And it's about the concept, like, because if you don't have the concrete ethical ground level right, like that's what it comes down to. Like if you don't have the concrete ethical ground level correct, then everything else is going to be a mess. And if you just focus on the mess and you don't focus on the concrete ethical ground level, well, then it's like trying, I don't know what the right metaphor is, but you're not at the source of where the fire started. Right? Like you're not at the source of where the fire started. Like the source of where the fire started is there. You've got to put that out. And if you put that out, then the whole will take care of itself. Because we're all individual human beings. We all appear as individuals in our consciousness. No one of us has the power to solve the meta crisis and the planetary whole. All we can do is take responsibility for our concrete ethical ground level. And if we all take care of our concrete ethical ground level, the rest will kind of manifest as a harmony, but or potentially as a harmony. So just as a sort of concluding note, is that I do think the unity between men's spaces and philosophy spaces, and people who have exposed themselves to both, could in principle approach this level of the concrete ethical space between men and women and children. And then if we want to call that space between men, women, and children, and I would probably be comfortable calling it this, if we want to call that space the theopolitical level, I think that is what it kind of is, because you're dealing with the most intimate, you're dealing with the most precious, and you're dealing with creation, because that's what it's really about. It's about creation. Then, then the conversation goes to, when we scale that, then the conversation goes to political economy. And so we've got to get the theopolitical then. So we've got to get the theopolitical right with men, women, and children. And if we do that, then we can approach the political economy questions, which are about this feeling, at least I'll express this feeling that men and humans in general, but I would say men in this culture in particular, who are well-educated, very smart, very accomplished, highly successful, that they are in some sense meritocratically marginalized in the contemporary institutions. And there's a lot of leveling pressures to get symmetry between men and women in all sectors. Like there are people in sectors whose jobs it is to make sure that men and women are equally represented everywhere. Right. And like there's a lot of people who that's their job. Like, and there's something off about that. There's something off about that intent, because it goes again back to this desire to have everything equalized exactly between the sexes, which doesn't quite represent the problem between sexual difference correctly, in my opinion. But to really make the point, to hammer the point home, is that I think on the level of political economy today, and this is something that I would love spiritual spaces to talk about more, there's this feeling of dramatic impotence, like that we don't have political power anymore, that we don't have economic power anymore, that there are radical inequalities in society, and that there is an inability in our current technological landscape to foresee what it would mean to build a real career that could support a family. And then that brings us back around to sort of like the concrete point, particular life story that Matthew brought to the table about having a child and being like, well, I don't have a secure structure in place to raise a kid, and I want to be a good father, and I want to be able to provide for my kid, but that external structure is just not in place. And I think the more men see society in this way, the more men who are going to be like, I don't even know how to start with this problem of having a relationship and being not a provider, but being a contributing member of a family and building a family. Like that's not even conceived as a possibility. So then those men, and then I'll stop. Then those men fall into what I call the dark triad, which is the triad of masturbation, drugs and alcohol, and video games. And they'll stay in drugs and alcohol and masturbation and video games because that will keep them in a fantasy world where they feel like they have power, because they can't see how they could possibly have power in this world.
Yeah, Cadell, profoundly incisive, and just such appreciation for what you're bringing forward in this. I felt a real confluence as you were speaking, kind of unfolding within me. And I think I share that sensibility that somehow getting right the question of the spiritual foundation and the community that emerges on that basis is where the resilience and the capacity to then begin to address the beast of the socio-political becomes possible, and it cannot happen otherwise. In addition to that, it cannot happen insofar as we are paralyzed by these polarized conversations, which ultimately, from an economic perspective, seem to be serving the powers that be, having men and women at each other's throats, or having us kind of paralyzed, like what is a man, what is a woman, and these kinds of things that just completely undermine our capacity to begin to orient and move. Without addressing that, it's very difficult to organize and to meaningfully address and start to build the kind of world that actually serves our creation, that honors our divinity and our carnality, for want of a better term. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it there and let Matthew contribute.
Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, I'm feeling lucky, sitting here, happily married, and although my well, put it this way, where I am in terms of like career is not where I would have anticipated being at this age, at this stage of life, and the model that I think I started out with hasn't quite materialized in the way that I thought, and I feel certainly financially much more precarious than I would have assumed I would by now. And at the same time, I'm very fortunate in that my wife is okay with that and has as a psychologist, she's coaching clients. We're creating newsletters, doing talks. We have a shared. It's almost like it is a family business essentially that we're trying to develop. So we have the kind of skills or we're developing more skills that we can use to kind of create a viable family, like political economy, if you like, our own little subunit. And I'm fortunate to have a job in a nonprofit which keeps us going, and there's a constant process. It's not like I like my dad. It was like he was at work, comes home, he's got the money sorted. My mum does a little bit of work, but basically my dad is the provider, and he's working in big companies. And I've done a bit of that, but it's got to be something else. That's not going to work, because the sort of the lack of the sort of soul, the level of soul that you have to leave at the door of those organizations, or it's more than just leaving it at the door. It's almost the kind of corrosion that starts to occur. Means I can't do that. I couldn't do that in this particular environment I was in anyway. Not to rule it out completely, but that environment just I had an embodied moment of really recognizing I cannot be here. If it was my soul, it was like almost pulling me out of the door. But yeah, now we're in this kind of more precarious, more kind of fluid, improvisational, sometimes stressful, sometimes quite exciting, creative, generative space. And so I'm lucky, but I'm aware that not everyone is as fortunate to be in that place. So like, I think, Jacob, like, this is going to be super interesting for us to have a space to bring these kinds of questions forward for men. Because a lot of the time we don't want to own that vulnerability with each other. I know that even now I have very good old friends who are still in those big organizations who I'm very fond of. But I know that there's a little contraction in me, because I think, wow, I go and meet them, I have to really face the cost of leaving that system, and the security and the money, and the sort of prefabricated identity which I walked away from, but which, yeah, I mean, it's still not easy to I don't always feel confident that I've got it all together. I definitely don't feel that, but I'm optimistic that it's kind of working, but there are times when it's not so easy. So yeah, it's a navigation. Yeah.
No, that's really, really well put, Matthew. And like the compromises are so important there. Like it seems to me that very often in the current circumstance, you're either choosing to compromise on truth, you're compromising on your soul's integrity, or you're compromising on your health. And all of those things are really important to your health as a man. And it speaks to the larger problem that the kind of truth that would be able to challenge these systems or tyrannies that emerge, in the socio-political, is actively undermined by participating in a lot of those institutions. And it's for that very reason that many of us find ourselves exiled and building outside of them. And as you spoke to, Cadell, this re-emergence of Christianity is a really important piece of the landscape, and one that we've been delving deeply into, and has been kind of re-emerging in the collective consciousness ever since Peterson's biblical lectures, probably in 2018, and not solely externally, but something that's coming up through us, and something that's come through me in the context of my own plant medicine explorations and so on. I think that we need the most profound spiritual resources that we've ever had to face this circumstance, not just of the precarity, the precariousness, not just of the confusion at the level of the social and at the level of the identity of who am I now as a man without all of this, and how do I forge a way forward? How do I take what was good from behind and bring it through but that all of that is occurring in what, from many people's standpoint, seems to be right on the fucking edge of falling apart as a system, whether it be at the level of the ecological substrate on which all of that rests, whether it be the seemingly impending imposition of new forms of collective control and totalitarianism through the digital layer and through global organizations and things of that nature. Like we are in the squeeze on this earthly plane, and our capacity to connect with Christ, or what that represents for me, which is the divinization of flesh and the realization of a personal relationship to the divine. I don't think we can get through the eye of the needle of this time without that. And I think the pressures upon us are going to continue to have this forcing function in which everything that's bullshit is going to turn pathological or get burnt off. And so we do seem to be in some sort of crucible, both at the level of our spirituality and of our masculinity. And we need both. We absolutely need both. And I've observed in recent times that, within the church, within Christianity, there is a lot of more traditional masculinity seemingly doing pretty well. Like some of these young male pastors and so on that I've seen, you can feel that there's a strength, there's a substantiality to them that they've been able to cultivate in that context. And yet there's a whole lot of issues in the reintegration and the wrestling with Christianity as something that's become separate from culture into the rest of culture. And so, in a sense, the resonant man, like, who is the resonant man? How deep do you want to go with that question? For some people, the resonant man is Christ. It's the most divine male archetype or force that could possibly guide you. But it's not only that. It's not orthodoxly that. That's what it means on some level for me.
I love that, and I love the way you're framing that and holding space for both of. I love the way you're holding space for that contradiction, that the resonant man is Christ, and it's not only that. And I think that does a lot to the way you're branding and framing and building the space, because it's going to both allow you to sort of stay true to the truth of that, while also inviting people who either have not discovered that for themselves or who are finding a different sort of cultural expression of that. So I think that's really key. And I want to also sort of bring attention to the Peterson moment in regards to this, and specifically what you referenced, the biblical lecture series. That the subtitle of that biblical lecture series was "The Psychological Significance of the Bible." And the psychological significance of the Bible, I think that's important, because what Peterson's doing there is he's not reifying external myths and having us just identify with them. What he's trying to get us to do, I think, is to be in touch with the psychological drivers. What are the psychological drivers that we need to connect with today? And I think that also brings us back to where Matthew's been working with Thomas Hubel, and sort of the psychological and the spiritual dimension of these things. And the drives. I also sort of wanted to speak to this contradiction that Matthew's juggling, and which I juggle myself, and which I'm sure, Jacob, you juggle yourself, in regards to the cost of leaving the system. And in the cost, because I left I sort of, at a certain moment, I said, I'm not willing to continue compromising with the system in the way that it is. I sort of made a choice, and I sort of expressed that choice to you guys in the context of the story of when I started my own Dialogos around sex, masculinity, and God. That was kind of a gesture for me because that work was not produced for academia. It was just self-published, right? And I was just like, okay, well, I need to have this conversation outside of academia, right? So, but there's a cost to leaving academia, and then there's something that you're sacrificing there, and there's a certain disempowerment and disenfranchisement that there's a Christ moment there. There's a Christ moment there in leaving the institutional structures. And I wanted to also speak to that in the context of, just for a brief moment, some of the philosophical work that I'm currently focused on, which is largely this shift from Marx to Hegel, which is sort of a paradoxical movement in the history of philosophy. It's usually the opposite move, but I can sort of connect that move to what Matthew was talking about when he was frequently referring to himself as in a precarious situation. So, but I want to speak to that because that's a really important point that you're bringing up, is the precarity of the situation. Because when Marx was articulating his idea of the working class, he had the idea of the proletariat. And the idea of the proletariat was that it was an empowered working class. And the empowered working class could take ownership of the means of production. But I think that the concept that I find most resonant to me now, and it's proposed by an economist named Guy Standing, who's a Belgian or a Dutch economist, is the concept of the precarious class. That we now find ourselves as a precarious class. We're more a fragmented working class that doesn't have the capacity to own the means of production or even see ourselves as a unified entity. So it's more like a fractured rabble than it is an empowered working class. And I think that in that situation, then that brings us back to the wrestling with Christianity. In that situation, what should we do? I think increasingly I see the power of the family business as a key element. And you also pointed to that emerging in the context of your relationship as the family business. I think we should think about the family business in a new way today. And I think we have the opportunity to think about the family business in a new way today. Because I want to just give quickly a story that my granddad told me, which is he said, I would much rather be in your world than my world, because in my world, women were uneducated and women were trained into dependence on men. But in our world, we're not in that situation. Women are more educated and women are not being trained into dependence on men. And I don't want my partner to be trained into dependence on me. I want my partner to be able to stand on her own. I want to be able to stand on my own. And I want us to be able to synergize in a way that men and women haven't been able to before. So I find that as an empowering challenge. I find that as an empowering moment. And I also am lucky enough to have a partner where we are in a situation where we can approach those conversations as well. And I try to use that experimentation and learn from that experimentation so that potentially I could, as I make mistakes and continue to figure out what that means for our relationship, share that journey with other men who are starting their own relationship and starting their own journey in that way, because I think there's a lot of power there. There's a lot of power in terms of how men and women, and here's the key, is how men and women can transform their utilitarian education, which was taught in such a way as to tear us apart, and taught in such a way as to keep us dependent on institutions in a certain unreflective way, towards a more insightful education where we can use our new education and we can use our new skills to reapproach what it means to build a family together and build a life together. I think there's a huge possibility there. And then the final note I'll say is that to me, this comes down to the problem of the human species, which the human species has never been able to resolve, which is that we are the species that can create both biologically and culturally. All other species can only create biologically. They can reproduce themselves organically. But human beings can reproduce themselves organically and we can culturally create. And that has historically always been the central tension point. Because if you reproduce biologically, then you have to sacrifice your cultural creativity. But if you create culturally, then you have to sacrifice your biological creativity. How can we do both? How can we both create how can we build families and culturally create? I think whoever can solve that issue is going to steal the culture. And I think that it's going to be the type of man that hopefully will be engaging in the 8-week program, The Resonant Man.
You know, it's an incredibly novel approach that I've taken and kind of brought Matthew along for the ride in some sense with these dialogues, such as what we're having today, Cadell, because as much as it's like fundamentally infused with a focus on wisdom and a desire for philosophy to be key to it, it feels like a very new thing to just like bring forth the men's initiative and bring it to all of the most hardcore philosophers that certainly that I know. And to like it feels like we're really situating this in relationship to the hardest questions that those minds are coming up with. And I really feel like you're bringing that today.
Yeah, and I've appreciated the perspectives you brought, even on my own predicaments, if you like. And it's kind of fun, isn't it? Like I'm happy to be the living laboratory where we can put me into the philosophical grinder and see how my circumstances play out in these different frames. And I love your endorsement of the family business as the new unit of civilization. I mean, that's given me a real lift. So great, I'm taking that away from this dialogue, and appreciate that.
Because a lot of the people because you might go to the institutional settings and you might say they have more security and they have more stability, but there's a certain illusion to it as well. And there's a certain fragility internal to their affective relationships, which they've been able to avoid precisely because they've had a type of stability and security, which means that they can not really deal with these issues that we're talking about men, women, and which is really the ethical ground of everything.
Yeah, I mean, going through the desert, going through the dark night of the soul, going through what's borne out when you walk the hard road, when you walk the insecure road. This is actually essential to the call in Christianity, and I think it's expressed probably in Buddhism as well, to some extent with renunciation, but like leaving that behind, leaving behind a kind of home, which is corrupted, in order to go on a journey to become the kind of person that can actually create the more just and the more true home, is a significant way of looking at what we're engaged in. And a big step in that is to move from isolation into fellowship and into co-journey and into cultivating deep, long-term relationships of integrity in the context of which we can grow. And I think that whilst it may seem precarious, the reality of faith is life providing. And I think that in my experience, when we are attuned to the resonant man, doors open. And the resonant man in us and the resonant man in the other are in communication. And so I see it as really important also that particularly younger men engaged in this are forming those intergenerational connections of fellowship as well. And that's partly where some of the economic question can begin to be answered as well. There are many, many people who have made their way in that traditional system, but their ultimate fealty is to God and is to helping others on their journey and helping to kind of build a kingdom, a more true, good, and beautiful world. And so I can't imagine anything more important and more worthwhile to take the risk of walking an unknown, pathless path in pursuit of that. And ultimately, there's a different kind of wealth that we're cultivating in the Resonant Man and in our respective journeys, which I have a very strong sense does translate and will translate and is already beginning to kind of seep back in through osmosis into the existing economic landscape. And the important thing is that we're capable of re-entering that with integrity. And that integrity is going to come precisely through the actual relational security of these connections and fellowships and communities devoted to staying true to the course, because there are going to be a lot of forces that are precisely oriented to undermining that. So wow, I'm feeling feeling closer to the masculine mission aspect of this as a consequence of this conversation, and I always do when I speak with you, Cadell. So my appreciation always for getting fired up and also put in the oven myself.
I don't know if you listen to Anthony Fantano, The Needle Drop.
I have not.
Oh, never mind. It was just going to be a cultural reference, but he always ends his music review videos where he says, "I'm feeling a light to decent number on the album." And when you were saying "I'm feeling," I was like, I thought you were going to give like a review of the entire. I'm feeling like a light to decent 7 right now. I'm feeling like I'm feeling like a strong 9 on this conversation. No, but this has been fantastic, and it's been really great to not only continue our dialogue, which I feel like there's just many threads we're just continuing to explore here between us, and really fantastic to meet you, Matthew, and really excited for whatever future threads might open up between us. And I'm glad some of the philosophical dimensions were so synergistic with some of the personal life experience dimensions. I just want to say, as my final sign off, is that's been my guiding post since I left. That's when I left the institutions. The only sort of given that I had to rest on was keeping the philosophical in relationship to the personal. And that's sort of that's what's been the line that has kept me in faith, I suppose. That's the pathless path, I guess, is just that line, yeah.
Yeah, Cadell as well. Amazing to meet you. And as I said, I took so much from all you brought philosophically and how it helped me to look at my own dilemmas and fears and insecurities and hopes and dreams with a new level of resolution or high fidelity, as you would say, Jacob. So thank you. And I do hope that I'm sure that we'll continue this connection.
Wonderful. Well, that draws our dialogue to a conclusion. And those of you who are interested to check out the Resonant Man vision and potentially register with us this June can do so. That will be linked into the Substack below this video. And we're going to be commencing on June 9th. Is that right, Matthew?
Yep.
June 9th. So
Sunday, June 9th. Yeah.
8 Sundays during the course of this summer, diving in, developing a field of wisdom, and exploring topics that really matter together with mutual support and co-journey. So really excited to do that. Thank you so much, Cadell.